What are you doing up there, Charlotte? Oh, making something, she said. Making something, as usual. Is it something for me? Asked Wilbur. No, said Charlotte. It's something for me, for a change. Please tell me what it is, begged Wilbur. I'll tell you in the morning, she said, when the first light comes into the sky and the sparrows stir and the cows rattle their chains, when the rooster crows and the stars fade, when early cars whisper along the highway, you look up here and I'll show you something. I will show you my masterpiece.
Ho-dee-oh, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we are reading E.B. White's classic children's book, Charlotte's Web.
Yeah, now I've read it many times to myself, even as a child, and to others. But this was your first time reading it, wasn't it?
This was my first time reading it all the way through. I think I mentioned this on previous episodes, so I'll keep it brief. But I have read bits of the ending of the book to my nephew when I was visiting one time, and he was in the middle of it. And could Uncle Chris read it? And I'm like, of course, I'm happy to read. I've read him other things. But this time it's like, oh no, we're reading the end of Charlotte's Web. I haven't read this book, but I know how it ends. So he had read it many times before.
He was okay.
Well, he was sad and a little weepy, but he was okay. Like he didn't need consoling.
Yeah. How old was he?
Oh, he would have been about 8, I want to say.
Mm-hmm. I think that's about right. I think a lot of kids read it roughly around that age. Which is the age of Fern, right? The main child that we follow. So that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. I'm super curious, though, from you. Now, you read this when you were a child and you read it to your children, right?
Yeah. I think it was my aunt gave me as a box set at Christmas when I was probably 7, a 3-book set. It was Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, and The Trumpet of the Swan. And these were all by E.B. White. And I didn't take it off the shelf, I think, for a little while. Maybe I didn't get into them for a little bit. And then I really loved them. I particularly love Stuart Little. I think that was my favorite of them. But Charlotte's Web, obviously, is the canonical one, right? It's the one everybody reads. And then, of course, as my kids got to the age of reading, I would read to them all the time. And Charlotte's Web was a book that was a little bit more of a kid would read by themselves kind of thing. Like you could read it to them, but it was a child who was already reading mostly who would have that book. So it's a book that I feel like I've inhabited in a lot of different ways. And so looking at it for today was weird, right? Because I was like kind of going back and forth between, we always think about the reader we were when we read the book before, when we're returning. And for me, it's multiple points in time.
Oh, excellent. Well, I will say Charlotte's Web seemed written to be read aloud, like very intentionally so. And I think it would have been a delight to have read more of it to a child.
Yes, that's what children are good for, to be read to. That's the main thing.
That's what they're there for.
I agree.
Well, we should talk a little bit about the book and about its author, E.B. White.
Should I say a little bit about him?
Sure, go for it.
So his full name is Elwyn Brooks White, and he's born in 1899 at the very end of the second to last century, died in 1985. He was born in Mount Vernon, New York, and attended Cornell, where he worked on the newspaper there, the Cornell Daily Sun, and he spent much of his life working for newspapers and magazines, particularly well known for his writing for The New Yorker. So he wrote tons of essays, fiction, all different kinds of things. And among his publications, it's worth noting that he co-wrote with James Thurber a book that came out in 1929 called Is Sex Necessary? Or Why You Feel the Way You Do, which is described as a spoof of Freudian jargon. I haven't actually seen it myself, but...
I've seen it, and the humor doesn't hold up as you'd expect a nearly 100-year-old book to do. I mean, it's interesting and it's fine. And if you like James Thurber, certainly you know what you're getting in for. I had not put the connection between that book and E.B. White in my mind. I hadn't made that connection. So it was remarkable when I was looking up his life to see that, oh yeah, that's him. Huh. You don't think about it when you read Stuart Little or Charlotte's Web, I bet.
It's a little different. Now, as I mentioned before, these 3 children's books, Stuart Little, which came out first in 1945, Charlotte's Web, which came out in 1952, and then almost 2 decades later, The Trumpet of the Swan in 1970. And people might recognize his name, too, from his involvement in William Strunk's The Elements of Style, often called Strunk and White. Strunk had come out with this book in 1918, basically a book about how you should write, and not just in terms of grammar, but in terms of the voice you might like to have. And White did a total revision of it, which came out in 1959. And Strunk had been one of White's professors at Cornell, so there's clearly a kind of, teacher-student kind of relation that infuses that collaboration as well. And White won a Pulitzer for his letters, his essays, and the full body of his work in 1978. One thing I'm just really struck by in all of his work is I think he's a beautiful writer. In other words, just his ability to like use the tools of writing, like just a craftsman, I guess. I mean, I know that's a kind of a tired metaphor, but can't think of very many writers that are just so sure in managing language. I kind of admire that.
Yeah, I haven't read any of his letters or essays.
I've read a lot of the essays. I like them a lot.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. As far as the elements of style go, I don't like that book at all, but that's okay. It's okay if you like it. I totally see why people might like it.
It has a great voice. I mean, I agree that the thing, what it tells you to do is stupid. I agree with you, but I just love the controlled and playful nature of the language in it.
Yeah, and if you haven't thought about the things that it's bringing up, it's definitely going to give you good food for thought. You just shouldn't take it as gospel, which too many people do. Strunk had passed away by the time White did the edit, so it wasn't necessarily, a collaboration per se. It was more revisiting something that White had encountered when he was in college and then remembered many, many decades later, wrote an article about it, and then was invited to update the elements of style. And it's still in print and still being revised and assigned in classrooms today.
I know. It's ridiculous, though. I just opened it to a page at random. So, like, for the word clever, he says, note that the word means one thing when applied to people, another when applied to horses. A clever horse is a good-natured one, not an ingenious one. I mean, it's ridiculous.
It's a very short book. That's quite a lot of real estate for that thought.
I know.
Huh. I mean, I ate those kinds of books up when I was a kid, I have to admit.
I know. I have to say I encountered it when I was really young, so maybe that's part of it. Like, it's a little nostalgia going on there as well.
Yeah. Anyway, back to Charlotte's Web.
Mm-hmm.
We should talk about what the book is in case somebody hasn't read it. I guess spoiler alert, but you probably know most of what happens in it. So here goes. So one day, 8-year-old Fern Arable, which is quite a name. Let me just put it out there right now. Fern Arable convinces her father to spare the life of a little piglet, the runt of the litter. She's tasked then with raising the pig, which she does with tremendous dedication until the pig, who she names Wilbur, is grown up enough that it's sold to her Uncle Homer Zuckerman, who lives up the road. She continues to visit Wilbur in the new barn and listens in as all the animals start to speak to each other. Now, Wilbur is sweet, innocent, and naive, but eventually he learns that his fate is to be fattened and eaten for Christmas dinner. And naturally, he gets a bit upset about this. Charlotte, a wise and patient spider, concocts a plan to save Wilbur's life, and with the help of a very selfish rat named Templeton, she begins writing messages in her webs. Some pig, the first one says. These unexpected spiderweb messages make the news, and soon people from all over are making a pilgrimage to see this special pig. Mr. Zuckerman decides to enter Wilbur into the county fair, and while Wilbur doesn't win, an increasingly exhausted Charlotte spells out one last message in her web: humble. And Wilbur wins a special prize for all the attention he's brought to the fair. Charlotte uses up the last of her energies laying an egg sack filled with 514 eggs. And as Charlotte lays dying, Wilbur carefully ensures that the eggs go back to the barn with him, and he protects the sack until the spiders hatch.
It's a great story.
It's a very sweet story.
And dark.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that opening line is quite something. Where's Papa going with that axe?
Yep.
Right? And you're like, whoa, what's going on? It's an incredibly tense situation, but it's also the imminence of death, right? And that's going to be deflected. Fern is going to persuade her father to let her raise that piglet. But that darkening of the door kind of in that opening paragraph is going to come back at certain moments in the narrative, and not just in the obvious kind of heavy-handed way when Wilbur learns that he's being fattened up for Christmas, but also at other moments as well, more subtly. It's a children's book, right? But it's also a very dark children's book in a certain kind of way, and that's maybe one of the reasons why it survived.
So that first line goes on. Where's Papa going with that X? Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. And then we have a long discussion about Fern running out, talking to her father, begging and pleading not to kill the runt of the litter. And then when he finally agrees, it's like, go back in, have your breakfast. We'll talk about this in a bit. And she sets up breakfast. And then, as Fern comes downstairs, having changed into her clothes, the kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. Just subtly snuck in there, with nothing drawing attention to it, is a perfectly normal breakfast food for many people, bacon.
Yeah. And so you can't forget for a minute what the economy of life and death is here.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the opening, I think, is terrific in a whole bunch of different ways. That the aspect you just described is one of them. Another is, how can I put it? We know where Fern stands on this. She thinks this is a terrible injustice. And we know that her father will, give in and let her raise the piglet. But the moment when that happens, I find really enigmatic in some ways, and I'm curious about what you think of it. So she's arguing with her father. She says, "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. And I think that's such an interesting moment, right? Because it is kind of funny. Like Fern is like, an idealist. "I see no difference. This is the worst injustice ever," right? We've all heard children describe the worst injustice ever. My daughter Camilla at one point discovered, this is a digression, but I swear it's relevant, discovered when she was like maybe about this very age that the farming of chickens is such that when they're boy chicks and girl chicks, the industrial farmers will get rid of the boy chicks in a very inhumane way.
Right.
And she discovered this somehow on TV. And she was so upset that she mounted a campaign to save boy chicks. I mean, she made posters and signage. There's a lot of signage. I know. I mean, we were supportive, but it was like really sad. Anyway, so partly that's what's going on here, right? Like Fern is, trying to fight this injustice, right? And her father gives in, and partly he gives in because like this is a beloved child, fine, he'll give in. But this whole thing, like this queer look on his face, he seemed almost ready to cry himself. So you got to wonder what is it that's in that moment? Like this is a man who is a farmer, right? So he raises things and he kills them at the appropriate time because that's how you do it, right? But he does not fail to recall on some level what it was to see it the other way, maybe. I just think it's an interesting moment.
Yeah, it's unclear whether he's convinced by the argument, whether he's seeing the runt of the litter to be like if his daughter had been, a runt, so to speak, or if it's that he doesn't want to upset his daughter, who he loves, and he doesn't want her to think of him as a monster right now. So there's a few different things that could be going on to persuade him to not do this. And also, like, maybe there's also a sense of sort of humility where it's like, well, this is how you're supposed to do it, but maybe the world is bigger than this. Maybe there are other possibilities.
Yeah, I feel like it's a really important moment in that opening, right? Because it gives you the sense that people do things that they have to do, but that aren't right, but they have to do them, right? And how we're going to navigate that is something that unfolds through the whole course of the book.
And of course, I love that it's a queer look that comes over his face as he enters into a new realm of possibilities he hadn't thought of before. Like, that's way too perfect.
Yeah, and the enigmatic nature of that, right? I mean, I think that's part of what that term is doing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it opens us out into this whole question of the human-animal divide. Like when Fern had said, "Oh, would you have killed me if I was too small?" Right? That opens up that whole question. Well, what is the difference between a human being and an animal? Mm-hmm. Right? So it's a book that's really inviting us to think that through. And when she goes on and she feeds the piglet with a bottle like a baby, Wilbur gets described as her baby repeatedly there. I find that really interesting, what's going on.
The other side of that I find really interesting is that when Wilbur is moved to Mr. Zuckerman's place and lives in the barn, and you have a bunch of other animals around, the animals start talking to each other. And this is a weird moment because the animals haven't been talking for the first couple chapters, and now suddenly they are, very abruptly, as soon as Fern leaves. And so you think, okay, well, maybe this is new rules in this new space. But then eventually it becomes clear that Fern visits and hears what the animals are saying. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And she will eventually talk about it to her parents. And her mother's going to get incredibly upset that she's making up the fact that she can hear these animals talking to each other, which, the truth status of that, I mean, in the book, they are talking to each other and she can hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because what that's doing is opening up for us this whole question of, I don't know if this is a heavy-handed way to put it, but like the death of Fern's childhood, right? I mean, she's in a time of life when she can hear what the animals are saying to one another. I mean, she's in a particular space, right? And where she sees no difference between herself and Wilbur, and she sees injustice in a certain kind of way. But she's being pushed to exit that period of life. Or I don't know if she's being pushed, but
there are some pressures on her for it. Yeah, absolutely.
There is some pressure, but she's also moving out, I guess you could say, also of that, from that period of life. And so it's a book that's about death and the imminence of death in a whole lot of different ways, I think.
But it's also about recognition of the personhood of animals, right?
Yes.
Like if these animals are talking to each other, that's one of the things that people traditionally have thought of as defining humanness or personhood or a certain set of rights. She's experiencing that. She's taking them seriously in a way that her father, off to kill the run to the litter, isn't taking the pig's life as seriously as he's taking his daughter's life.
Absolutely.
So, and part of growing up, part of not believing that the animals talk to each other, that you can overhear them, is believing that these animals aren't persons. So that's sort of part of adulthood, right? That's part of what she has to give up.
Yeah, she has to give up the personhood of animals.
But the book pushes back against this idea in a number of different ways, right? First off, because as we read it as sort of outside observers,
we hear the animals.
We know that they're talking to each other. Right? Like they absolutely are talking to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we're totally on board.
Yeah. And then there are also a few other characters who, again, are sort of alive to the possibility that they might be talking to each other. So in one of my favorite chapters of the book, Fern's mother has gotten upset about her daughter talking about the talking animals to the point where she goes and sees a doctor. And it's not quite clear what kind of doctor he is, if he's just a general practitioner. He's described as having like a beard and little glasses, like he's a psychiatrist, right? Like he has that sort of Freudian look to him in the illustration in the book as well. But I mean, he may just be a normal doctor. It's not clear. But either way, like she's talking about psychological issues with him. And so Mrs. Arable, they've been talking for a little while, and Mrs. Arable says, Fern says the animals can talk to each other. Dr. Dorian, do you believe animals talk? And he says, I never heard one say anything, but that proves nothing. It's quite possible that an animal has spoken civilly to me, and then I didn't catch the remark because I wasn't paying attention. Children pay better attention than grown-ups. If Fern says that the animal in Zuckerman's barn talk, I'm quite ready to believe her. Perhaps if people talked less, animals would talk more. People are incessant talkers. I can give you my word on that. Like, it's so great. Good. When I was reading this section, I didn't know how it was going to go, and I was pretty sure that like the girl wouldn't get institutionalized or anything. But like, whether I didn't really expect the doctor to be supportive of her position, but he goes above and beyond in terms of supporting her. He's completely open to the possibility that she's right. He trusts the girl as like knowing what she's talking about, or at least understanding that if the kid's making it up, it's not harmful in any way. Like it's fine. And that's so excellent.
Yeah. You were opening up a little bit earlier the way in which the speaking of the animals, like where we as readers sit relative to that, like Fern, we hear the animals speak, and we're even there when Fern's not there. Like Fern comes and goes, but we still hear the conversations in the barnyard, even beyond that. And it does an interesting thing. I hadn't thought about this before. It does an interesting thing because it puts you in the position of the child who can still hear the animals, right? You can still understand the animals. And people, I know it's like a cliche, right? People have a hard time with this book, right? Like, because it's really sad. Like, like literally everybody is weeping when they get to the end of this book. I mean, even if you've read it a million times, you know what happens. And I'm like, I've been wondering for a long time, why is that? And I wonder if it's because it's awakening the sense that like there's a thing there's a way you are in life, and then you have to give it up. And you're always full of sorrow about that, right? And maybe it's awakening that, because it's true, right? There is a thing you lose, right? And there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, this book is about the process of growing up, and what happens in that loss. I mean, there's a long tradition of books that are about growing up and losing, even specifically losing the ability to talk with animals, but also just sort of the disenchantment of the world that happens with it. I mean, Tolkien is all about this, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But even beyond that, all sorts of children's books, all sorts of fantasy books are looking at this idea of age and disenchantment and losing access to some of the things that made childhood special. Mm-hmm. I like that there are some adult characters in this book who are at least open to the possibility of going back to it. Earlier in that conversation with the mother asks if he understands how there could be writing inside a spider's web. Mm-hmm. Oh, no, said Dr. Dorian, I don't understand it. But for that matter, I don't understand how a spider learned to spin a web in the first place. When the words appeared, everyone said they were a miracle, but nobody pointed out that the web itself is a miracle. Mm-hmm. And this ties in with another moment in the book, which is when Wilbur decides he's going to learn how to spin a web. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. He goes through all sorts of maneuvers to try to like attach string to himself and jump and fly. And like Charlotte's just explaining gently, like, here are the steps. You need your spinnerets, and then you sort of jump and you hover in the air, and your spinnerets spin out some web. Go for it if you want to. And he gives it a couple tries, and it's like, it doesn't work. And she's like, well, yeah, you don't have spinnerets. But there's a similar sense from her in that scene where she's like, I can do this. Mm-hmm. But there are types of doing this that I can't do. And there's all sorts of, like there are mysteries in the world. Even I, as somebody who does this, doesn't fully understand. There's a position of adulthood and authority that accepts that we don't understand everything in the world and is humble in that moment. And both Dr. Dorian and Charlotte model that kind of being an adult, unlike almost everybody else in the book and in real life.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's so striking that you see, I think, that, childhood way of seeing and then these other ways of seeing in how Wilbur is regarded. Like, we're starting to unpack that a little bit earlier, but Fern gets permission to rear Wilbur on a bottle like a baby. And then she treats Wilbur as a baby, but also kind of as a toy, right? Like when she's out walking with Wilbur, sometimes he would get tired and Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage alongside the doll. He liked this. And if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked cute when his eyes were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel her carriage very slowly and smoothly so as not to wake her infants. So there's this weird, in some ways it's just a scene of a child playing, right? So it's like totally normative, right? But it's also a scene that kind of allows us to think about, what is Wilbur? Is Wilbur a baby? Is Wilbur a toy? What is Wilbur? And that's why there's like such a kind of little frisson, like there's like a little shock when we start to see that there are people for whom Wilbur is meat.
Right, yes.
So not a person at all, right? So there's this one moment that kind of foreshadows it when the goose is listening and thinks to herself, she says, there's a lot of things Wilbur doesn't know about life. He's really a very innocent little pig. He doesn't even know what's going to happen to him around Christmas. He has no idea that Mr. Zuckerman and Lurvy are plotting to kill him. And like plotting, it's like it's murder, right?
Yeah.
From the perspective of the animals, right?
From a goose, which is like an alternative Christmas dish, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole question of her goslings and what happens to them every year, like she knows how this game works, right?
Yep.
And then just a few pages later, there's this fantastic scene where it's not the goose, because everybody knows, all the senior animals know this, right?
Yeah.
So the goose knows. And then the sheep is just bold as brass. The sheep is like, she says, you know why they're fattening you up, don't you? No, said Wilbur. Well, I don't like to spread bad news, said the sheep, but they're fattening you up because they're going to kill you, that's why. They're going to what? Screamed Wilbur. Fern grew rigid on her stool. Kill you, turn you into smoked bacon and ham, continued the old sheep. Almost all young pigs get murdered by the farmer as soon as the real cold weather sets in. There's a regular conspiracy around here to kill you at Christmas time. Everybody is in the plot. And she goes on, when a pig is to be butchered, everybody helps. I'm an old sheep, and I see the same thing, same old business year after year. Arable arrives with his 22, shoots the... She gets interrupted. And it's like this erupt... I don't know what to call it. It's like this break kind of in the narrative of like this like brutal reality where, like I said, Wilbur is not a person. Wilbur is not a baby or even a toy. He's meat.
Yeah.
And that's going to like shift things in all kinds of ways.
There's two particular things that I'm hooking onto as you read that out. One of them is that in that first scene, the goose is thinking to itself, which is another layer of sort of personhood, interiority, right? Not only is it talking to the other things, but it is thinking. It's thinking and reflecting about what's happening or the things around it. So again, there's a deeper level of personhood, and that's something that Fern has no access to, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing, is that in that second scene that you read, Fern is there. You mentioned that Fern hears the news and
she's horrified.
Yeah, it goes bolt upright or whatever it was. But she doesn't do anything about it in the rest of the book. It's not like the very first scene where she hears that the pig is going to be killed that day and she runs out and pleads the case for it. She's much more passive, and it's going to be up to the animals to figure their way out of this one, which most of the animals don't even care to do. Like, they've accepted it.
That's right. They see it as inevitable, right? That's a really good point about Fern, because on the one hand, it's like this passage from this childhood state to this other state. And there are many moments where we see Fern and she's very much still in the state of being a child. And then there's moments we see where she's moving. Things are different. And this is one of those. Like you said, she may perceive this as terrible injustice, but she's not going to act in the way that she did in that opening scene. Remember what her father says to her? He says, control yourself, Fern.
Yeah.
right? She's learned a little bit to control herself. She sits up, right, in the chair, but she doesn't jump up. Like she's controlling herself. That's the passage, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this carries on. Like, for example, again, in that fabulous chapter with Dr. Dorian, I expect this is a chapter that most kids find boring, but I loved it. At the end of it, well, says Dr. Dorian, I think she will always love animals, but I doubt that she spends her entire life in Homer Zuckerman's barn cellar. How about boys? Does she know any boys? She knows Henry Fussy, said Mrs. Arable brightly. Dr. Dorian closed his giant eyes again, went into deep thought. Henry Fussy, he mumbled. Again, what a name. Remarkable. Well, I don't think you have anything to worry about, etc. And sure enough, by the time of the big fair, Fern and her brother get set off with some pocket change. And one of the things that happens is that Henry Fussy invites Fern to go up in the Ferris wheel with him. He'll pay, and they get to see some remarkable things. And I think Henry Fussy shakes the cart to make it, all scary and fun like that. And from that moment on, she doesn't give a damn about Wilbur. She is all about Henry Fussy and getting back up into that Ferris wheel with him. And okay, on the one hand, I get it. We're telling the story of her transitioning from one part of her life to another part of her life and sort of discovering boys. And on the other hand, I feel like E.B. White did Fern real dirty here.
Well, I don't know. I wonder if he's also kind of reflecting it's like the barnyard, right? It's like the way it is. At the end of that chapter that you're reading from, with Dr. Dorian, they're talking about Fern this whole visit, right? And then at the very end, right, he says, it's amazing how children change from year to year. How's Avery? He asked, opening his eyes wide. That's the brother. Oh, Avery, chuckled Mrs. Arable. Avery is always fine. Of course, he gets into poison ivy and gets stung by wasps and bees and brings frogs and snakes home and breaks everything he lays his hands on. He's fine. Good, said the doctor. Mrs. Arable said goodbye and thanked Dr. Dorian very much for his advice. And we know that Avery is raising holy hell continuously through this whole book.
Yeah. And Mrs. Arable just described it.
Yeah.
And it's yeah, that's fine.
And that's normal.
Yep.
Right? Because as you get to a certain age, right, control is gendered. Self-control is gendered.
Absolutely. And this is E.B. White sort of underlining this idea, right? This couldn't be more starkly pointing this out and saying, ugh, to it all.
Oh, yeah.
I imagine E.B. White had little time for children such as Avery.
Yeah. And it's really poignant because I remember I was struck by this when I was rereading it for today, that there are a number of moments where Fern and Avery are kind of on a level playing field, right? So there's a scene early on where they're both swimming, and there's a fantastic scene. And I really loved it because as a mother, I was like, oh God, why are they doing this? But as a child, I was like, oh, I wish I could do this. There's a barn swing, which is actually a rope with a big rope tied across a beam with a knot on the bottom of it.
Yep.
Right? Oh, it's so great. So I have to read this description. Mr. Zuckerman had the best swing in the county. It was a single long piece of heavy rope tied to the beam over the north doorway. At the bottom end of the rope was a fat knot to sit on. It was arranged so that you could swing without being pushed. You climbed a ladder to the hayloft. Then, holding the rope, you stood at the edge and looked down and were scared and dizzy. Then you straddled the knot so that it acted as a seat. Then you got up all your nerve, took a deep breath, and jumped. For a second, you seemed to be falling to the barn floor far below, but then suddenly the rope would begin to catch you, and you would sail through the barn door going a mile a minute with the wind whistling in your eyes and ears and hair. Then you would zoom upward into the sky and look up at the clouds, and the rope would twist, and you would twist and turn with the rope. Then you would drop down, down, down out of the sky and come sailing back into the barn, almost into the hayloft. Then sail out again, then in again, then out again, then in again, then out, then in, and then you jump off and fall down and let somebody else try it. As a kid, I was like, oh my God, I wish I could do this. And and as an adult, I read it and I was like, oh my God, those children.
I mean, that sounded like something I would have hated as a child. I hate the thought of it now. But
no, but I mean, the point is that that they're on this level field. And then when they get change at the fair too, right? They get the same amount. But then there's these other things that are pulling at that gender divide.
Yeah. I want to point out one more thing about that swing scene, which is that mothers for miles around, he writes, worried about Zuckerman's swing. They feared some child would fall off, but no child ever did. Children almost always hang on to things tighter than their parents think they will. And that is a level of sort of trust and empathizing with the child's perspective and the child's autonomy that, again, is sort of delightful and features throughout the book. There's a sense in which childhood is being sort of praised as more sensible than adulthood in some ways. And part of it is like understanding, yeah, no, you're gonna hold real tight. You're gonna hold on as tight as you can. And the adults might think, even if you hold on as tight as you can, accidents can happen. But nevertheless, there is some sort of sympathizing with the child here that I really appreciate.
Well, it's an incredibly subtle move, right? Because, normally you get this kind of teleology of childhood into adulthood, right? Where like to be an adult is to be a more developed sense of what you already are as a child in some sense, right? And there's places we see that happen. And this book is not doing that, but it's also not idealizing or making like sugar sweet what it is to be a child.
Right.
Right. Instead, it's kind of saying, the way children are, that's also a good way of being.
Yeah, exactly.
If you could hold on to it, which you can't. Right. That's you know what I mean? It's a very poignant message.
So as you were saying, the brother and sister do sort of meet up along the way, are treated very similarly in certain moments. But it's interesting. And again, this is part of why I think that she gets done dirty by E.B. White. When it's time for Wilbur's triumphant receiving of a special medal, she's nowhere to be found. She could not care less. She wants out of there. She wants to hang out with Henry Fussy, and she's going to be very fussy in demanding some money so that she can go do that. Avery's there. The brother is there and sort of grabs the spotlight in this somewhat annoying, but, not the worst he does kind of way. So he's still there. He's still participating in this in at least some way, but she's gone. And it just seems so unlikely that even if she's getting a little bit older and even if she's swept up in Henry Fussy, like she's still an 8-year-old and this is her special pig that she saved a couple months ago. And it's hard to imagine that she would switch on a dime so aggressively. I know that it sort of has to happen for the point of the book, but it feels unfair to her.
You're right. I was actually, as I'm thinking now, like when I read it, for today, I was like, oh yeah, Fern's gone. But I remember reading it as a child and being really angry about Fern.
Yeah.
It comes back to me that I was really angry that why is she, where is she going? What is she doing?
Yeah. And part of that is also because Wilbur's need for a friend is going to change, right? Wilbur is going to be moving away from his own childhood, where he was sort of dependent upon Charlotte and dependent upon Fern, and become more of a parental figure to Charlotte's eggs and then Charlotte's babies, and then, become a friend to the handful of Charlotte's 514 eggs. 3 of them stick around to live in the barn with Wilbur, and they stay his friends. And I guess generations and generations of spiders continue to stay there, and some of them stay his friends. And he becomes in this very different relationship. But like Wilbur is no longer the child and doesn't need a Fern in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really neat point you're bringing out there, both with regard to friendship and the ways in which, how can I put it, friendships can almost be, or can be family, right? There can be chosen family, right? And this book is really doing all kinds of interesting work with regard to friendship. Like you were saying, Wilbur outgrows in some ways his friendship with Fern, and then even with Charlotte, like he doesn't need her in quite the same way, and he enters into a different kind of relation. And we hear, like White talks about friendship and the nature of friendship at certain really key moments. When Wilbur has first gotten to know Charlotte, he's kind of got a little bit of uncertainty, like, because she catches flies and eats them, she's kind of intimidating in some ways, right? And he thinks this to himself. Again, interiority, as you mentioned earlier, right? Well, he thought, I've got a new friend, all right. But what a gamble friendship is. Charlotte is fierce, brutal, scheming, bloodthirsty, everything I don't like. How can I learn to like her even though she is pretty and, of course, clever? Wilbur was merely suffering the doubts and fears that often go with finding a new friend. In good time, he was to discover that he was mistaken about Charlotte. Underneath her rather bold and cruel exterior, she had a kind heart and was to prove loyal and true to the very end. And that all comes true. And the closing line of the book kind of brings us back to this friendship, this fundamental friendship. And again, it's a great closing line, same way it's a great opening line. It's not often that someone comes along who's a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both.
Yes.
Which is just like the best epitaph ever, right? And it's so great. But this question of friendship, right? Like, so what is friendship for? What does it constitute? What is it, what are the things that bind people to one another? And of course, the irony is that, when we talk about what are the ties that bind people to one another, we're talking about animals.
Right.
And it invites us to think about that whole splitting, right? That time when we split apart our understanding of animals as persons versus animals as meat.
So we're talking about animals, but we're also talking about, the relationship between animals and people, right? Like is Fern able to be a friend to Wilbur? Or is she just able to stand in that kind of mothering position? And similarly, you think about Mr. Zuckerman, who isn't going to kill Wilbur after he's won this prize, after he's become so special and such an important part of his life. Like, he gets the respect to continue to live, on the farm, which is fantastic. But I mean, they're not friends.
No. I don't think a human being other than a child could be a friend, right?
Well, yeah.
I mean, in this world, in the book, as we have it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem so, right? Nobody ends up being that way. But at least the animals can be friends to one another.
Though also they can be like terrible, like Templeton the rat, of course, is a great character.
So Templeton the rat, yes. Templeton's really interesting because I did not quite understand just how self-centered Templeton was. From vaguely remembering seeing bits of the animated version of this and hearing people talk about it, I was unprepared for the wall of self-interest that is Templeton the rat.
Did you like the character of Templeton or dislike him?
I mean, I disliked him as a person, so to speak, but I enjoyed his presence.
Yeah. I remember even as a child, like, obviously I knew he was bad, but I found him absolutely, like, fascinating. Like, I had a grudging fondness for Templeton, even though he was really bad.
Yeah, he's completely charming, but he doesn't get redeemed as a friend.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, even in the very end, when it's like life or death matter about saving the eggs, Wilbur has to make a deal with him, has to make concessions to get his help securing the egg sack. Like, he is in no way interested in doing things out of friendship. He will do things, quid pro quo.
Yeah, it's a great moment because Templeton is particularly awful, right? And Templeton's got a very particular vocal register. Like, he's very, you can really hear, their voices in this, right? So Wilbur is begging. He's like, "Oh, but Templeton, if you don't stop talking and get busy, all will be lost and I will die of a broken heart. Please climb up." Templeton lay back in the straw. "Die of a broken heart," he mimicked. "How touching. My, I notice it's always me you come to when in trouble, but I've never heard of anyone's heart breaking on my account. Oh no, who cares anything about old Templeton?" "Get up," screamed Wilbur. "Stop acting like a spoiled child." Templeton grinned and lay still. And he just pulls that all out, right? He just strings that all out. And then Wilbur has a brilliant idea. He says, "Templeton, I will make you a solemn promise. Get Charlotte's egg sack for me, and from now on, I will let you eat first when Lurvy slops me. I will let you have your choice of everything in the trough, and I won't touch a thing until you're through." The rat sat up. "You mean that?" he said. "I promise. I cross my heart." "All right, it's a deal." Right. And it's a great scene, right? Because there's a lot of suspense, right? I mean, if you're a little kid and there's a lot of suspense, right? What's going to happen? What's going to happen to the egg sack, right? And then the pleading and then the mockery and all that, right? And then the food is what makes it all come through, because that's the one thing Templeton does love.
But, of course, Templeton doesn't know that Wilbur has been thoughtful about him in the past. There's a scene where Wilbur is eating, and it goes, "He planned to leave half a noodle and a few drops of milk for Templeton. Then he remembered that the rat had been useful in saving Charlotte's life and that Charlotte was trying to save his life, so he left a whole noodle instead of a half." Sort of unasked for, Wilbur is humble. Like, that's the last word to describe him. He doesn't try to turn this nice deed into... he's not going to hold it over Templeton's head. No. He's not going to say, "I did this for you, therefore you owe me." He's just like, "Oh, no, Templeton actually has been really helpful lately. I'm going to make sure he gets a little extra food and give up my food for it." And Templeton doesn't know that this has happened, right? Like, all these nice things that have happened to Templeton that Wilbur has done, he doesn't recognize as having been intentional through Wilbur, or he doesn't admit to it anyways. So it's absolutely a fascinating portrait of somebody who is just egoistic and obsessive. And...
Oh, I know. Well, that's the thing. They have personalities, right? I mean, like the old sheep and then the geese and stuff like that. Like, they really have robust personalities, right? And that's, I think, kind of fantastic. Because, as we were saying before, it lets you enter into that realm of that, the childhood realm where animals speak, right? But in a very non-saccharine kind of way.
Yeah. I wonder if we should wrap up by thinking a little bit about sort of why this book, and maybe why other children's books tend towards animals. Like, what do you get from having this be a story about animals?
This is the exact thought in my mind too. I really wonder about this because there's a ton of them like this, right? Like why that? I actually was talking about this just yesterday. And I know this sounds probably terrible. So having raised some children, right? I raised my own children. There's a way in which when they're really small, they're a lot like animals. And I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but you feed them and you clothe them and you take care of them and you take care of their bodies, right? And you understand them as subjects, but they're only becoming subjects gradually, right? And so, because I was thinking about relationships with animals, something we talked about in a previous episode, right? When we were talking to Anna Wilson, right? We were talking about relationships with animals and how those can be quite emotional and quite like relationship-y in a way. And it's not total, at least in my mind and in my experience, it's not totally different from my experience of small children. I mean, I love them all, but it's different. I mean, it's different from the relations that you have with like human beings. And so I wonder if on some level, I mean, it has to do with that. In other words, disambiguating animals from humans, right? Drawing that line is something that is intimately bound up with our understanding of the nature of children and our understanding of our own nature as children or having been children. I wonder.
That's very possible. The other thing that I was toying with, the other idea I was toying with, I don't know if I buy this, but I'm going to throw it out there, is I'm wondering whether there's a sense in which if you want to tell this kind of story about death to children, perhaps especially, death of animals is both more intense and less intense than death of humans. It can be something that maybe can be felt a lot, but in a strictly fictional way, where it doesn't impinge upon the scariness of humans dying, but actually you can kind of also feel it more because it's a cute animal. I don't know if that works. I don't know if that's how people think about these things, but there certainly seems to be some sort of empathetic advantages to having it be about animals.
Well, I think, when you're saying that, it makes me think about the death of animals as experienced by my own children and also as experienced by me when I was a child. And one of the reasons that I think, if it's possible in your household if you have children in your household and if it's possible to have animals, I feel like it's a really good thing to have them. And there are many reasons why, but one of the reasons why is, they have shorter lifespans by and large, right? I mean, not all, but many animals do. And they'll die, right? While a child is still a child. And that is, there are good lessons to learn there. They're good. Well, I think it's true.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, oof.
No, but there's sorrow and there's grieving. But these are things one has to learn how to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not saying you get animals so they will die, but I mean, if they become part of your household and you love them and you understand them as a really important part of it, and then you lose them, I mean, it's painful, but it's also educational, if I can put it that way, and the book invites us in all kinds of ways to think about death and life, and death in life. And we get this with Wilbur, especially, and with Charlotte, but we also get it with the egg. You remember the geese have 8 eggs and only 7 of them hatch. And what happens is there's one egg that, just did not hatch. And so Templeton takes it because Templeton loves to squirrel away things, right? He's like, you have 7 goslings. There were 8 eggs. What happened to the other egg? Why didn't it hatch? Goose is like, it's a dud, I guess. And so Templeton takes the egg. And then when Mr. Zuckerman comes over, he sees the goslings and he goes, oh, hello there. He says, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 baby geese. Now, isn't that lovely? And so the dud egg becomes like a kind of a joke and a plot turn, like it breaks at a crucial moment, the whole barnyard stinks and so on. So it's a plot device, but it's also it's a lot like Wilbur being the runt among the other pigs in the litter in the opening, right? There's life and then there's death, right? Like death is always in the middle of it. And the egg is kind of like, I don't know what to call it. It's like this harbinger of doom. I mean, it's funny and it's a plot device, but it's also like a reminder that there's always death.
And it's interesting how sort of the adult geese, so to speak, accept that the dud egg is just a thing that can happen. Mm-hmm. And they're going to cherish the geese that are alive, I suppose. But, the egg, whatever, it's a dud egg. Sure, Templeton, you can take it. And Templeton cherishes this dud egg sort of like how Fern cherishes, the runt of the litter, in a sense. Like, oh, this needs to be saved. Oh, I know exactly what I want. I want this to be my toy, so to speak.
It's true. It is very similar.
That doesn't progress very far because the egg isn't Wilbur. It isn't going to start talking, and you can't have those kinds of relationships with it. But you get this sense of an alternative version of how the main plot line could have been thought about if you didn't accept the idea that Wilbur has some sort of personhood.
I think that's exactly right. That's a beautiful way to bring out what the egg is for, like one of the layers of the narrative. And, time is linear, right? When we start out the book, right? There's this doom that's hanging over Wilbur's head in the opening pages in the form of the axe, right? And so we have a sense of linear time. The seasons are going by. But by the time we get to the end, and especially with Charlotte's Children, we get a sense of like the cyclical nature of time, like that one year succeeds another, and that brings knowledge and it brings something else. And there's this beautiful moment, which is, it's maybe 2/3 of the way through the book, where we get a sense of that shift from linear time to cyclical time. And I just love this part. It's the beginning of chapter 15. It's called The Crickets. And it starts like this. The crickets sang in the grasses. They sang the song of summer's ending, a sad, monotonous song. Summer is over and gone, they sang. Over and gone, summer is dying, dying. The crickets felt it was their duty to warn everybody that summertime cannot last forever. Even on the most beautiful days in the whole year, the days when summer is changing into fall, the crickets spread the rumor of sadness and change. Everybody heard the song of the crickets, and it lists them. The children know that means that school would soon begin again. The young geese heard it and knew that they would never be little goslings again. Charlotte heard it and knew she hadn't much time left. Mrs. Zuckerman at work in the kitchen heard the crickets, and a sadness came over her too. Another summer gone, she sighed. Lurvy, at work building a crate for Wilbur, heard the song and knew it was time to dig potatoes. And it's a really subtle passage, right? Because it's just like, the song of the crickets, everybody hears it, but it means something totally different to people, right? It means for the children that school will begin again, right? For the geese, they won't be goslings ever again, right? So it's about that passage from one time in life to another time in life. Mrs. Zuckerman, too, perceives it in cyclical terms, a summer gone and wistfulness. And Lurvy's like, it's time to dig the potatoes, right? It's that year turning around.
It is. I think I would disagree slightly with Mrs. Zuckerman thinking about this in cyclical terms. I think it's actually interesting that some of them are experiencing this as a cyclical thing. The crickets are, as is Lurvy, as is Fern. Like, school's starting again, potatoes are starting again. This is a thing that's repeating, and it's going to keep repeating. Mrs. Zuckerman, at least as I read that, is understanding that, like, time is passing, she's getting older.
Yeah, I think there's that tension. And the crickets, too, right? The crickets know it's cyclical, but they're going to all die, right?
And Charlotte hears it and knows that she's going to die soon.
That's right.
And while there is something cyclical about her bringing new spiders into the world, like, from her perspective, this is going to end. So,
right.
So you're living in linear and cyclical time at the same time, where that same moment of time, that same potential reminder of the cyclical nature of time, is going to be understood from different positions as being linear or cyclical.
That's right. So it's a surprisingly deep book in all kinds of ways, right? Like, that's what I mean. It's a dark book in all kinds of ways, but it's like, I don't know, I still find it very moving.
I think about how at the end there are new spiders and generations after generations of spiders to keep company to Wilbur. But Wilbur probably isn't going to have kids. And if he does, there's no reason why Wilbur's kids would be afforded the same luxury and freedom that Wilbur's been afforded. So these generations of spiders will experience Wilbur linearly, even if he experiences a cyclical life with spiders.
Yeah.
It's interestingly unbalanced that way.
Yeah. It's a very mysterious book in some ways.
Well, that is going to wrap up our animal cluster, but we did ask listeners to write in with suggestions for other animal books we could have considered, in addition to The Conference of the Birds and Bear and Charlotte's Web, and we got some really interesting suggestions. So I thought we'd share a few with you and, make your reading list even longer.
One of the suggestions I was really struck by was from Sean, who suggested we do Watership Down, and I'd heard somebody else recommend that to me too. I've never read it. Have you read it?
I haven't read it, but I watched the film for the first time last year, and it's real rough. I mean, not bad, harrowing. Like, it's an absolutely intense, sad, everything goes awful. Like, imagine Charlotte's Web, but everybody dies.
Oh, I don't like that.
No. And like there's a follow-up book and film about dogs, which is apparently even worse in terms of how grim it is. And I was like, nope. But, Watership Down, I mean, it's a classic for a reason. And
world building, right?
Yeah, Sean points out that there's tremendous world building for a bunny story. And that is true as far as I know of the book version. I know that there's all sorts of invented vocabulary for words that the bunnies use to describe human technologies and so forth, cars and whatnot. But like, I don't think I could do that book.
No.
We got a few other suggestions. Let's see. Anna, who we chatted with in our bonus episode, also suggested H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, which she describes as a brilliant book about intense animal-human connections. It's a memoir of her grieving for her dad after his sudden death by raising a goshawk, combined with a history of the meaning of hawking and the goshawk in English history, and a lot of stuff about T.H. White, the author of The Once and Future King, and his struggles with he raised hawks, I guess, or tried to, and his struggles with his own sadism, which is a whole interesting angle. She says it's an incredible book. Everybody I know who's read this book has loved it. I don't know if you've taken a peek into it.
Somebody else had recommended it to me. Actually, I had been intending to pull out this book because they didn't mention the part about T.H. White's struggles with his own sadism, which I have to confess is sort of, you got to wonder what that's about. But they told me about it in terms of the grieving part, that it was really evocative in terms of how you inventory sorrow, like how you deal with that. So I'm really curious to look at it.
Yeah. Let's see. What else? Brendan suggests The 11th Hour, which is a children's book by Graham Bass. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's an illustrated book in which several animals come over for a party and they play a lot of games. And then at 11 o'clock, when it's time to eat, they realize someone has eaten all the food. And the reader has to look through elaborate drawings to find clues to determine who the culprit is, because the book doesn't tell you. Brendan says it's one of his favorite children's books. He's not positive it has a ton to say about animals, but it's a fun read, lavishly illustrated, with more for the player to discover than they think when they reach the very end. And I think this is a delightful suggestion. I don't know if we could do it in this format, but the idea of this kind of children's book that tells a story, but then you have to look back and like dig through these very, from what I've seen, very elaborate illustrations. It's like a Where's Waldo kind of book, but it's all about figuring out who ate the food. I don't know. This seems like a way of thinking about books that we don't usually get to think about here. Mm-hmm. And that alone makes me excited about the suggestion.
That is kind of neat. Another one of the suggestions we got was from Dyson, who suggested 15 Dogs, a book that came out in 2015 by Andre Alexis. And this novel has Hermes and Apollo, the gods, placing a bet on whether animals could live happily if they had the cognitive and speech faculties that humans have. So they give this ability to some animals in a veterinary clinic in Toronto and see what happens. I have to confess, that sounds like a really great premise. I would love to find out what happens.
I haven't read this. I've read other books by Andre Alexis, and they've been delightful. I'm told that there's quite a lot of animal death, as you might imagine. Animals in a veterinary clinic might experience, so be warned. But again, everybody I know who's read it has loved it, and it got a lot of accolades here in Canada. So yeah, and Dyson says it's got some interesting takes on how the pack mentality in existence would evolve with heightened intelligence.
That is interesting.
Yeah. And one more. Carl, who works on animals in academia, suggests Whim Chow, Flame of Love, which is a collection of poetry by Michael Field. It came out in 1913. Michael Field was a pseudonym for Catherine Bradley and her niece Edith Cooper, who wrote poems and verse dramas. They both passed away around 1913. This book is a set of exuberant poems about their dead chow, their dead dog, Whim, W-H-Y-M.
Wow.
You can find a copy online. I started reading it. It's a lot. It's very Victorian, very over the top
Flame
writing.
of love.
It's so much. It's so much. And it's one of those things where, sometimes you encounter a book and you're glad that scholars are reading it and putting up with this book because there's no way you'd want to do it. It's amazing, and I'm glad people are writing about it, and apparently has really interesting things to say about women and their relationships to dogs at that time period, and it pushes in interesting directions. People have been writing about it. It sounds great from that point of view, but in terms of a book of poems that I'd want to read, no. It's definitely worth poking a nose into, though. Anyway, thank you to everybody for sending in your suggestions. It's always good to add more things to the list, and this has just made me want to read more and more and more. Mm-hmm. But we will get to read more and more as we turn to the next cluster, which is going to be a little cluster about history.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this set of 3. Should I mention what we're reading?
Yeah, they're going to be books about history playing out in really interesting ways in texts.
Exactly.
And so what are we going to start with?
We'll start with Virginia Woolf's Orlando, which some people might know the film that was made of that. And it's a book that I read at a young age. I don't know if you've read it more than once, but I think it'll be really fun to talk about together.
I think I've read the book just once, but the film is one of my favorite films. So I've watched the film to the point where I have most of the dialogue memorized.
Oh, wow.
And I'm excited to reread the book now. And then after that, we're going to be looking at another classic, but a slightly more recent one, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this because I'm so fascinated lately, and I know I've bent your ear about this, with counterfactual history. In other words, what are counterfactual histories for? I'm just really interested in thinking about that, and I feel like this will be a great book for us to do that with.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read it. I'm going to look forward to reading it again. Yeah, and you only just read it for the first time recently, right?
I actually haven't read it yet. I mean, I've been waiting to read it because I've been reading a lot of counterfactual histories of different sorts, and it had come highly recommended to me, and I've been kind of I was going to read it anyway a few months ago, but then we decided to do it. I'm saving it so that it can be fresh. Like the response can be fresh.
Well, I hope you like it.
I think I will. I mean, it seems kind of like a great premise. And then finally, we're going to do something a little different, which is still a book, sort of, or at least a text, and it's about history, but in a very interesting kind of way. We're going to do the Hereford Mappamundi.
Yes.
Which is a map that is full of text, and we're going to read it. And that's going to be, I think, a great way to do our 50th work, right? Our 50th main episode.
That'll be our 50th episode, absolutely. And yeah, this is a medieval map. It's a well-regarded and much talked about map.
When people mention like one pre-modern European map, that's the one they tend to mention more than any other, I think.
Yeah. And so treating it as a text and seeing what we can make of it. I'm super excited to give this one a go. It might be a slightly tricky one for us, but we can do it.
It'll be fine.
I'm looking forward to it. So until then, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/47. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.